All right, team, here we are. Well, I had to leave the beach. I'm back home now in Nashville, but I had a really nice time. Today, we're going to pick up where we left off with this lecture, talking about, we're in plant stems at this point. We're going to talk about that and also move into leaves. Talk a little bit about leaf abscission. The word abscission means the leaves fall off the trees in the fall. And lots of other things. We'll see how far we get. I had all this opened. I don't know where it went. And you can see where we are in your Moodle. We are in the Plant Organs PowerPoint. We made it through roots. And I believe we were right here talking about monocot and dicot, and we had a little aside, if you recall. We talked about annual versus biennial versus perennial. We talked about woody versus herbaceous and monocot versus dicot. These are all different sort of artificial ways to group plants. And we were in the process of talking about monocots and dicots, I think. We also said you can put these words together, like herbaceous perennial dicot would be a good example of something like a dandelion. Okay, so again, the cotyledons are the seed leaves, and when they come up out of the ground, they're the first leaves, they're not the true leaves. So a good example is corn. It has one cotyledon, and for a dicot, beans, sorry, I know this is all coming out angled. It's a little hard to write on the board. Beans have two cotyledons, so they're dicot. So that's one way to tell them apart that we talked about. We also talked about flower parts in threes in a monocot or fours or fives in a dicot. There's actually yet another way to tell them apart. We talked about leaf veins being parallel in a monocot and reticulate, which means branched like a spider web, in a dicot. So that's 1, 2, 3 ways to tell them apart. Count the cotyledons, count the flower parts, look at the veins. And so one thing that I want to mention to you, you have to be careful up here with annual and perennial. These words only really can apply in the plant's habitat, its native habitat. For example, tomatoes and peppers and eggplants are actually perennial plants in they come from the tropics. And so we grow them as annuals because they're not cold hardy. So if you plant, for example, an eggplant here, it grows throughout the growing season, and then when it gets cold, it dies. Well, in Bolivia, where I visited, there are eggplant trees and pepper trees in people's yards, and these are, no telling how many years old they are, so they grow indefinitely. So you have to be careful about this idea of whether something is a perennial or an annual. It only applies in its habitat. Okay, so now we get to this slide, and what I want to point out, what you're looking at here is the vascular bundles. And let me just take a screenshot of it and point some things out. Be nice if it was a little bit bigger. I'm sorry. Let me make it a little bigger first and then take a screenshot of it so we can actually see it. And the funny thing is, if I know I can maximize the screen, but if I maximize the screen, then I can't get to my screenshot. It's just one of those technicalities. What you're looking at here, I'm going to circle some. These structures are called vascular bundles. And you can see them in the monocot as well. They're smaller in the monocot. And now I'm going to tell you a fourth way to tell a monocot and a dicot apart. In a dicot, the vascular bundles form a cylinder or a ring around the stem. And what you're looking at is the cross section through a stem of an annual monocot over here and an annual dicot over here. And so you can see that the vascular bundles have this pattern where they go around and form a ring. In the monocot, they're scattered. So you have scattered vascular bundles here, and you have sort of a pattern of vascular bundles here. What is a vascular bundle? It's basically a vein, right? What's the vascular tissue? Xylem and phloem. And so if we just take one of these and we draw it up here, it's going to be arranged like this. You're always going to have phloem to the outside, xylem to the inside. And then what makes xylem and phloem? What is this region right here in between the xylem and the phloem? The vascular cambium. So this is the vascular cambium. And you can see it, you can see it right here really well, right in this region, right in this region. Now in the monocot, the vascular bundles are arranged just the same with the xylem to the outside and the phloem to the inside. It's just that they're scattered all around. But if you could see these a little better, you would see the xylem is still to the outside and to the inside and the phloem to the outside. So, this isn't a very practical way to tell a monocot from a dicot if you're walking around outside, but if you are looking at a slide, then you'll be able to tell them apart. Okay. Exciting stuff, y'all. Jeez. Moving along, secondary functions of stems. Well, just like there were storage roots, there are storage stems. This plant that you're looking at here is called kohlrabi. Anybody ever eaten kohlrabi? I don't know. That's a word I know how to spell. This is a storage stem. Okay, so that's a good secondary function. This is an edible plant. It's related to, it's a brassica. Anytime you hear me use that word brassica, the Brassicaceae is the mustard family. So what are some important crops in the mustard family? There are lots. There's kale and collards and broccoli and cabbage and cauliflower, kohlrabi, radishes. These are all brassicas. And so this particular brassica has a storage stem. Okay. That brings us into our discussion of leaves. And, you know, in terms of the function of the leaf, well, the leaf has a very specific function. Its primary function is very specific. And so if we think about that, oh, I hear some thunder outside. We think about the primary function of leaves, photosynthesis, right? The photosynthetic organ, that's the primary function. Okay. And if we look at a leaf, and this is a little bit of a strange way to look at a leaf. And you know a good bit about leaf morphology now. You know about compound leaves and lobed leaves and all that from the lab that we did, right? Or the lab video that you saw, okay? Now this is a little bit of a strange way to look at a leaf, but what you're looking at is you're looking at the leaf in cross section. And, you know, leaves are really flat, right? And so it's weird to think that they have depth, but they do. And so here's the top of the leaf and here's the bottom of the leaf, for example. And there's lots of stuff to see in this image. And so we're going to spend a goodly bit of time here. Unfortunately, there's a misspelling here in the image. I love this image, but unfortunately, this word is incorrect and I don't have a way of really fixing it, but I will fix it on the screen. So if you take a look at this, you'll see that there are four very distinct layers of thickness in the leaf. At the very top surface of the leaf, we have what's called the upper epidermis, which you would expect. It's the upper covering of the leaf. And you'll notice that sitting on top of this single layer of cells is a waxy cuticle, right? We have a cuticle that covers our skin as well. It keeps the water from evaporating. The cuticle prevents desiccation or drying out of the leaf. It's impermeable to water. Okay. Then we have, this is the incorrect word right here. We have this next layer right here, which is called the palisade mesophyll, not chlorophyll, of course. Chlorophyll is a molecule. Okay. And palisade is like a column. These are very column-shaped kind of cells like this. And we're going to see an electron micrograph in the next slide where you actually get to see a real leaf and you can see if you can pick out the layers. Just below the palisade mesophyll, we have the spongy mesophyll, and that's this area here. What do sponges have? They have holes, right? And so these cells aren't nearly as tightly packed, and there's lots of spaces in between them, and we're going to see these spaces are very important. And then at the bottom, we have the lower epidermis. So we have two of the four layers are just the skin, and the cuticle is not a tissue layer. It's just adheres to the epidermis. So what's going on in these different layers? Well, the palisade mesophyll on the top of the leaf, just below the upper epidermis, is where 80% of the photosynthesis occurs. And then the spongy mesophyll is where the other 20% occurs. So it's an 80-20 split. Most of the photosynthetic activity occurs in these cells that we're calling the palisade mesophyll. And these are, it's not important to me that you know this, but I'll just tell you, these are modified parenchyma cells. And so they're a type of parenchyma. They're actually called chlorenchyma cells. The upper and lower epidermis, the function is pretty obvious. Now, we also have this thing, which is interesting. This is this region right here, and I'm going to draw this in a second. I want you to check out this cell, and it's cut away, but it would come all the way around. And then there's another cell here, but then there's also an opening. There's a space. This is called the stoma or stomata. And what it does is it provides an opening for gas exchange in and out of the leaf. This is very important. If you were to look down on it, and normally in most plants in temperate climates, the stoma, the opening, are only on the underneath side of the leaf. And we'll talk about why that is in a second. But if you're in the tropics, a lot of times you'll have stoma on both surfaces. If you were to look down on it, it would look like this. You'd have a cell like this and another cell like this. And then there's an opening. The opening is technically the stoma. So a stoma isn't really a structure. It's more of like a lack of structure. These two cells that sort of surround the opening are called guard cells. And the guard cells guard the stoma. Okay, what these guard cells can do is they can swell up and close that stoma, or they can shrink and open it. And so what that means is these holes in the bottom of the leaf can be opened or closed, almost like a door or a window. Okay, now let's look at what's going in and out. The plant needs carbon dioxide. Why? Well, carbon dioxide is the building block of photosynthesis. It's the carbon that makes the glucose molecule, right? So the only way that carbon dioxide can get in is if there's this opening. What's a byproduct of photosynthesis? A byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen, right? So oxygen can leave. What else leaves? That would be something else to think about. What else leaves the leaf if this stoma is open? Water. It says water vapor right here. H2O. I'm just going to write H2O and draw a little arrow. Now here's the trade-off for the plant. If the stoma is open, carbon dioxide can diffuse in. This is just simple diffusion, concentration gradient. The carbon dioxide diffuses in. The plant can photosynthesize. It can release its oxygen, but as long as the stoma is open, it is also losing water. It is a trade-off because the plant needs water and it's losing water in the process. This is just an implication of the stoma being open. And so what then happens to a plant is, as long as there's enough water, the stoma stay open and photosynthesis occurs. But as the plant dries out, as the ground dries out, and as the plant starts running out of water, it is forced to close this opening here. It's forced to close the opening. And in the process of doing that, it can't photosynthesize. Because of this, growth in trees, especially in temperate climates, is directly related to moisture. As long as there's plenty of moisture, the plant's going to grow like crazy. You can look at the rings of trees and how wide the ring is one year to the next, and it's a good predictor of how much it rained that year. Okay, so these stoma can open and close, and the plant is constantly opening and closing them. Can you think of a reason why in a temperate climate or a dry climate, the stoma would only be on the bottom of the leaf and not the top? Wow, lightning outside my window here. Listen. There's the thunder. So the reason is because the sun hits the top of the leaf. And this would create a warmer environment and more evaporation. So it's a way of conserving water to just have the stoma on the underneath. Plants that grow in water, or plants that grow in very wet areas, like bananas, for example, that grow in the tropics in very wet areas, they'll have stoma on both sides. Okay. So that's a pretty good little lesson about leaves. All right. Now let's look at the next slide. And now you're looking at an actual leaf. And you're looking at an actual leaf. Let me make it a little bigger before I screenshot it. See if you can pick out the layers. This is an electron micrograph of a privet leaf. Privet is a common shrub around here. It's rather invasive. Let's look. Well, if this is the top of the leaf and this is the bottom, then this must be the upper epidermis, right? Look at these palisade mesophyll cells. How nice is that? Right, beautiful, all the way across here. And then what's this? Well, this is think about a leaf, it has veins. This is a vascular bundle. Just gonna put VB. From this point on, VB is vascular bundle. Just get used to it. It's what we call them. And what's in the vascular bundle? Well, it's gonna have xylem and phloem and some cambium, right? Some vascular cambium. And then look at this, must be the spongy mesophyll. And look at all the space in here for the CO2. So this is a place for CO2 to gather. And then do we have a stoma? Right here is a stoma. So that's awesome. We can see all the different things we just talked about in an actual leaf instead of a drawing. So that's nice. Okay. Beautiful. We're doing really good, y'all. Let's see. Check on the time here. See how far along we are. We're 21 minutes in. Y'all are doing so well. That's what they always tell you when you go to the dentist. You're doing so well. We are almost done. Isn't that what they tell you? We're almost done. You're doing great. Just a few more minutes. We'll be done. What about secondary functions of leaves? Well, believe it or not, you know, what's an onion? An onion is these are storage leaves. And so we had storage roots, we had storage stems. Now, onions and garlic, really good example of storage leaves. There's the stem of the garlic. It's not really very much of a stem right there. And then these are the leaves, okay? So we have storage leaves. Now we must talk about this fabulous thing called leaf abscission. What a great time to be talking about it, because guess what? It's about to happen, right? It's about to happen. So what is leaf abscission? What does it mean? It basically just means leaves fall off in the fall, right? There is a process that occurs, a sequence of events that occurs whereby these leaves will ultimately fall off, right? Just a little bit of terminology. What you're looking at here, just so you know, this is the stem of the plant itself, the twig you might think of. This is the petiole, P-E-T-I-O-L-E. The petiole is the stem of the leaf. And so basically what you're looking at is this kind of thing. Here's the stem, and then you're not seeing the leaf, but it's kind of like this. And so this structure here is the petiole, okay? So how does the plant know when it's time to drop your leaves? Well, you could imagine that the first triggers are environmental. Environmental triggers. What are they? Well, what happens in the fall? Temperature. Temperature ends up being an important trigger that leads to this process beginning, but it's actually not as important as another trigger. What else happens in the fall? What happens to the days as we go into the fall? They get shorter, right? So day length, believe it or not, plants can detect the length of the day. They have photoreceptors and they are right in tune with how long the day is. Day length ends up being a really important environmental trigger that leads to leaf abscission. Moisture could also have an effect, particularly in a drought. Sometimes the leaves will fall off in August because they're done. They're like, nah, too dry, we're done, okay? All three of these play a factor. Well, what then happens in response to these environmental triggers is hormone production in the plant. Abscisic acid is a hormone that's produced. There's also one called ethylene gas. Abscisic acid, as the name implies, causes leaf abscission. It causes this abscission process to occur that we're about to talk about now. And then ethylene gas is another one involved in both the ripening of fruit as well as the senescence of the plant, or the senescence means to die, and it's kind of like plants die for a little while. Boy, it's really raining now, y'all. Okay, you're familiar with ethylene gas, the sort of smell of bananas as they are over ripening is you're actually smelling ethylene in the gas that's being produced. You may have heard that, if you want to ripen up an unripe fruit, put it in a bag with a ripe fruit, because the ripe fruit is producing ethylene gas. When they pick bananas in the tropics, they pick them dead green, and often what they'll do is they'll put them in the hull of the ship that they're traveling in, and they'll pump the hull of the ship with ethylene gas, and so then the bananas are actually ripening as they're en route to the destination. And they've gotten pretty good at it. It's usually they get to the store and they're just getting ripe at that point. Okay. Well, what happens next is 3. Let me clean this up a little bit here. Get rid of some of this stuff. And 3 is formation of abscission layer. Okay, what happens, it's really fascinating. You remember, plants have cell walls, right? And all the plant cells are stuck together with this glue called cementum. It's a good name, right? Cementum is the glue that sticks all the cell walls of plants together. Well, in response to these hormones, there's this one little region of cells right in here. It's called the abscission zone. And these cells, no other cells, but these cells are very sensitive to these hormones. And what literally happens is it dissolves the cementum. And all of a sudden, this glue that's been holding this petiole onto the twig, the glue just dissolves and then the leaf falls off. Okay, so that's how we have leaf abscission. But the crazy thing, y'all, is before that happens, what happens? Well, we see all these fantastic colors in the leaves. And what we are seeing is, before the leaf falls off, chlorophyll is a very valuable molecule, particularly chlorophyll A. It's the most important molecule to the plant because it's the photosynthetic molecule. It gets literally sucked back into the stem. And when the green is gone, we start seeing these different colors. Turns out that these colors are always there. You just can't see them. They're masked by the chlorophyll. And so it's kind of like, you could be looking at a green wall, and underneath the green, there could be red or, yellow, and you would never know. But once the green is gone, then you start seeing these other colors. There are other pigments that you start to see, primarily carotenoid pigments and xanthophylls. These are what account for the different colors of the fabulous fall. I get a little bit annoyed because everyone's always talking about whether it's going to be a good fall or not, and it's always a good fall. That's my spiel. Granted, some might be a little more vivid than others, but it's always pretty spectacular here. And what makes a good fall? Well, the more moisture we have during the summer, the more leaves the plant has. And the more leaves it has, then of course when they change, the more vivid and dramatic it is. So that's important. And then for it to dry out in the fall is important, because these accessory pigments are water soluble for the most part. And so the more it rains while they're changing, the more washed out they get more quickly, and they don't, they're not as stunning. that finishes up the vegetative organs. So, you know, it wasn't, if we were doing the vegetative organs of an animal, geez Louise, we'd be here for days and days and days, wouldn't we? All those organs. But for plants, at least the vegetative organs, no big deal. Not a huge deal. So we're going to move now into the reproductive organs. And what we're going to do, we can look at this slide for a second, but we're actually going to draw our own flower. The flower is the sexual reproductive organ of a plant. And so what we want to do is draw what we like to call a composite flower. Composite flower is sort of like a pretend imaginary flower that has all the flower parts. Whoa, it's getting closer. The rain, that is. Okay, so here's what we want to know. Form and function, you know, what does the part look like and what does it do? So we'll color code this a little bit. We'll start out with green. And if there's the stem, there's the, we study flower parts in series. Oh my God, that was close. That scared me, sorry. I just jumped. All right, so it would be really good if you could draw this with me. Mine's not going to be pretty because of this board that I'm drawing on. But I'm doing my best. I'm going to draw them. And then we're going to label them. Talk about each part. Okay, here we go. So the way that we like to study the flower parts is kind of from the outside in, you know. So we're going to start out here. We're going to work our way in, talk about each of the parts. We're going to give it a name, and we're going to say, what does it do? The little green bract here is called a sepal. And the thing about flower parts is you can count them, you know. You could count how many sepals the flower had. Now I've only drawn 2, but you know, and it could be that the flower only has 2 sepals. That's a possibility. However many sepals the flower has, collectively, we refer to that as the calyx, C-A-L-Y-X. So in my flower, I could say I have a calyx of 2 sepals. Now, what if I said we had a calyx of 5 sepals? Would you guess it was a monocot or a dicot? See, so we build on our knowledge here, and you would think, okay, flower parts in 5s must be a dicot. If it had 3 sepals, we might say it was a monocot. Okay, what do the sepals do? Protection. They protect the developing bud. Think about a rosebud that your sweetheart might give you and those little green clasping structures that are protecting the underlying flower parts. Okay. So this flower has a calyx. The next series of flower parts are called the petals. Please note, it's not pedal like pedal your bicycle around. It's petal with a T. And so again, I've drawn 3 here, or 2 rather. But what if it had 3 petals? Well, or 6 petals, then it would be a monocot, right? Collectively, however many petals it has, we call that the corolla. So we could say it has a corolla of 5 petals, or in this case, 2. Okay. What do the petals do? Well, they attract pollinators. Let me just try to do a little better job of writing. Pollinators. Pollinators. Like what? What are pollinators? Well, they're things that visit the flower, right? And why do they visit the flower? Well, it's interesting. There are lots of different reasons why they might visit the flower. If we start thinking about what some pollinators are, let's make a list. Insects, right? Especially bees. Oh, shoot. Now I get into this problem here where there's this control panel on the board, and if I touch it, it jumps. Insects, but especially bees, and you all know this, but any kind of insect can be a pollinator. You name it, it's a pollinator. Beetles, ants, flies, they're all pollinators. Moths, butterflies are important pollinators, and bees especially. What else? Birds, believe it or not, think about hummingbirds, bats in tropical areas. There's one that's not a living thing that's an extremely important pollinator, the wind. Many, many flowers are wind pollinated. Turns out that if you're wind pollinated, does the wind care if you have pretty petals? No, it doesn't care. The wind could care less. It turns out that many flowers that are wind pollinated don't even have petals. It's pointless to waste your energy on petals. What about this thing here, Homo sapiens, right? Homo sapiens, that's us, right? Humans, we pollinate with a purpose. We see something we like and we cross it with something we like, right? And so artificial selection, humans have changed the face of the earth with respect to what plants look like by artificially selecting for them and pollinating. If you think about broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, and collards, they're all the same species of plant. Humans have artificially selected for different traits by hand pollinating, okay? That's a pretty good list. What are these things after, Well, they're after insects, birds, and bats are after either pollen or nectar. Think about honeybees. They feed the pollen to their larvae and they eat the honey themselves. So they drink the nectar and regurgitate it, and that's honey. Birds are almost always interested in the nectar, like hummingbirds. Bats can feed on pollen or nectar. And the wind, of course, is just the wind. We are primarily interested in food, producing, something that we want in terms of horticulture or agriculture. Okay. Next, we have, now we're getting into the reproductive organs, and this entire structure here, let me change colors. This entire structure is called the stamen. You can remember it's the male. Because it has the word men in it. So just, anytime you see the word stamen, it's the male reproductive organ. It produces the male gamete. What's the gamete? The sperm, right? Plants have sperm. I know that's crazy. It consists of 1 and 2. And 1 is called the filament. And 2 is called the anther. The anther makes the pollen. And the pollen, believe it or not, is the sperm of a plant. How strange is that? The next time there's pollen all over your car, you're like, damn, look at all that plant sperm on my car. Nuts, huh? The filament just supports the anther, right? Okay, that's the male. Well, we got to have a female as well. And in the very center of the flower is all the important part, is the female part. I don't know what color that is. It might be this one. It doesn't matter really. I'm going to add a little bit to it. I don't think that's the same color, but it's fine. I'm going to add this right here. Okay. And this entire structure, now we run into some, terminology issues. Depending on who you talk to, what this thing is called. I call it a pistil. And we're going to say the pistil is the female reproductive structure. And we have 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, and 3. 1 is the stigma. 2 is the style. And 3 is the ovary. Stigma, style, and ovary. 1, 2, and 3. The stigma receives the pollen. The stigma is often sticky or hairy. And if the pollen gets on there, here's some pollen. Let's say the pollen gets on there. Then we say pollination has occurred. Pollination and fertilization aren't the same thing. Pollination occurs first, fertilization occurs later. Now, is this legit here? Can this flower, can its own pollen from this flower get on the stigma and we say pollination has occurred and later fertilization? Isn't that kind of like having sex with yourself? It is very much like that, genetically speaking. But it happens. Some flowers are self-fertile. Some flowers can, this is perfectly legitimate. The pollen can come from this flower and fertilization or pollination fertilization can occur all within this one unit. Other plants require outcrossing, like for example, apple trees require a second tree, not even a second flower, but a second tree to outcross the pollen. Okay. The style supports the stigma, kind of like the filament supported the anther. And then the ovary houses ovules, ovular ovules with egg. There's the female gamete, right? So this structure here is called the ovule with egg. And here's the thing. The ovule, upon fertilization of the egg, becomes seed or seeds. And it just turns out I've drawn a single ovule in the side of this ovary. That's legitimate. Think about plants that have, or fruits that have one seed, like a plum or a peach. But more typically, there are many ovules with a single egg. Each ovule has one egg projecting into the space of the ovary. And so then you get many seeds, like a tomato, for example. Okay. Wow, a lot of cool stuff we're learning today. Tell you what. We have a little bit more time. That's good. Let's think about the fate of these different structures. I told you that the ovule becomes the seed, the ovary becomes the fruit, ultimately. We might have to put a disclaimer here and say upon fertilization. Now, you might be wondering how this happens. Upon fertilization, the ovary becomes the fruit, the ovule with the egg becomes the seed. How does the pollen get down there? Guess what? On probably the last day of class, the last lecture, not the last day of class, the last lecture, we come full circle and we make it back to plant life cycles. This is as far as we're going to go with this right now. But we will revisit all of this information at the very end, and you will learn how plants have sex. You will learn how the sperm gets to the egg to make a little baby embryo inside of a seed. Okay? So fear not, we're going to learn that. Now, what I want to tell you is, take a look at this. This is what we call a model flower or a composite flower. And what it means is we're showing all the flower parts, okay? But it turns out that any kind of combination you can think of in nature exists. For instance, Some plants don't have any sepals. They just don't have them. Some plants don't have petals. We mentioned, plants that are wind pollinated, often they won't have petals. Some plants don't have any stamens. The norm in a plant is to be, in a flower, is to be bisexual, to have both male and female gametes produced in one flower. But that's not always the case. There are flowers that are either male and only have stamens and no pistils, or they're female and they only have pistils and no stamens. And so, a really good example of this is squash. If you look at a squash vine, there are male flowers and female flowers. Every year in the spring, I get the same text messages from friends and family, and you could imagine as a botanist, I get a lot of this. And they're saying, my squash plants are flowering, but I'm not getting any fruit. Well, the reason is because you're only getting male flowers at the beginning. Typically, the male flowers will start to open before the female flowers. You must have both flowers opening in order for pollination to occur. Okay? So I always tell them, don't fret. Eventually, you will get some fruit. It's just you have to wait. Okay? So, some flowers, now here's a wacky thing. Some flowers don't have stamens or pistils, and they're sterile, which seems completely ridiculous, but there must be some reason why the plant evolved like this. And typically, these flowers are just trick flowers. They're flowers to attract a pollinator to the real flowers, which tend to be not very showy. And so what they'll do is they'll make a real showy flower with sepals and really big petals. And along comes the bumblebee like, whoa, what is this? And in the process of checking it out is actually standing on the tiny little real flowers that just have male and female parts. And so, nature is very clever, very clever. Okay. Next time, what we have to do is talk about fruits. And so what I want you to do before you watch the next video is you need to find a fruit. You can buy a fruit, you can look, you probably have a fruit in your house. Kind of want to take a picture of this image. It's really nice. Let's see, I can save it. Let's save that just for the heck of it. Let's save that on the desktop as flower drawing. Just for fun, because I like it. It's a good drawing. Okay, here's the thing. What is a fruit? By definition, a fruit is the ripened ovary of a flower. If it makes a flower, then it makes a fruit. And so because of that, things that you typically think of as vegetables, let's say, are in fact actually not vegetables at all, they're fruits. Tomatoes are fruits. Green beans are fruits. Squash is a fruit. Eggplants are fruits. What are vegetables? Well, botanically, not a lot of things are vegetables. I suppose green leafy things like lettuce and spinach, you could call that a vegetable, or root crops like carrots. I'm going to tell you an interesting story. It'll be the last little thing we'll talk about. In 1907, there was a court case, and the court case involved a gentleman in Texas that was a tomato grower. He grew huge amounts of tomatoes, and he was making actually a lot of money growing tomatoes in Texas. Well, at that time, the government placed a tariff upon fruits. The reason they did this was because most things that were thought of as fruits were tropical in nature, like lemons and limes and oranges, and many of them were imported from the Caribbean. And so there was this import tariff which they were placing upon the fruits. Well, the government saw a way to make some money, and they said, well, you know what? Technically, the tomato is in fact a fruit. And because it's a fruit, we're going to place the same tariff on your crop, and you're going to have to pay us. And the tomato farmer said, well, no, actually, that's not fair because I'm growing it here in this country, irregardless of whether it's a fruit or a vegetable. So it went to court, and they had a court case, and the judge decided that botanically, although botanically the tomato is very much a fruit, legally it is a vegetable. And so the tomato farmer won the case, and he didn't have to pay the tariff. So what I need for you to do between now and your next video is obtain a fruit, because at the end of the video, you're going to have to know what type of fruit that is. And so we're going to learn about fruit types next time. It's rather interesting. I'll have a bunch of fruits, and we'll be cutting them and looking at them. And but I want you to have a fruit as well. If you can't afford to buy a fruit, hey, it's the fall. Go outside, wander around. You can find a fruit. Remember, if it comes from a flower, it's a fruit. And so there are lots of them on trees and shrubs and vines, and just look around. Okay. It's been great, y'all. Good job. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.